the Flexner Report, which some of you may have heard of this before. It was commissioned by Andrew Carnegie and strongly influenced by John D. Rockefeller. It standardized US medical education around germ theory. And what this meant is they shut down holistic schools teaching nutrition and homeopathy, paving the way for pharmaceutical dominance. This is not an episode about the Flexner Report or the kind of history of all of this per se, but go and have a listen to my episode with Sarah Valentini, an absolutely awesome homeopath that we use. And she talks a little about this in our episode. And I really enjoyed learning, like, where did homeopathics come from and why isn't it more relevant today than it perhaps could be when we found it to be so valuable? Now, going all the way back, early 1900s, Rockefeller's got this huge oil empire, and he's trying to figure out, like, how do I create more products? And that's where synthetic drugs come in, right? So they're sidelining natural terrain approaches that couldn't be patented. So in the 20th century, germ theory has absolutely hammered it. And it's true, antibiotics like penicillin, discovered in 1928, have had a huge impact and supposedly saved millions. Vaccines eradicated smallpox in 1980, or so they claim. And terrain theory just kind of lingered in alternative circles. And what's really brought this back up to two major things of the last 50 years, like AIDS, really fueled conversation around terrain theory. And more recently, the COVID-19 scamdemic, as I would call it. And, quite rightly so, these things have come into question because when you look back through the history, like the guys that are talking about terrain theory almost 200 years ago now were simply pointing out that there must be some reason why not everyone catches a disease. What can it be? So, and again, we'll discuss this as we go through the episode. So to spend a bit of time on the modern day, some characters that my wife mentioned, and again, shout out to Lozzie, she's awesome at researching the health space and creating what's the right way of saying this? She's revolutionized how I think about health and what I eat, and equally what our kids eat and the medications that we take and all the rest of it. So shout out to her. And this episode is dedicated to you, Lozzie, if you ever listen to it. So the first guy, Dr. Tom Cowan. Now, he's been a long-time advocate for terrain theory and uses his work to kind of dismantle germ theory. And he frames germ theory as part of a broader, quote, make-believe science, disconnected from observable reality. Cowan challenges foundational pillars of mainstream medicine, particularly virology and genetics, whilst promoting a holistic and environment-driven model of health. So what is his core critique? Well, he's like, he calls it flaws in virology. But to explain that a little more, so unstable paradigms built on manipulated methodologies like cell cultures and antibody testing that misrepresent how illness occurs. He argues that viruses aren't proven causative agents, but artifacts of poor science, echoing Béchamp's pleomorphism from 200 years ago, where microbes are symptoms of internal imbalance, not invaders. Now, of course, this ties directly to terrain. It's like disease stems from the body's terrain, not external contagion, i.e. the toxicity, the nutrition, the emotional state of a person. Now, he's got a podcast. I was able to find a quote from his podcast, which, what if the immune system and antibodies are misunderstood concepts? Illness isn't about fighting germs. It's about the body's response to imbalance. Interesting. So in terms of genetics and heritability, he really flips this idea of in terms of nature versus nurture in the debate on he's rejecting genetic determinism, i.e. cancer genes, and he just calls them fatalistic myths. Instead, heredity is environmental and educational. Now, passed down lifestyles shape terrain more than DNA. This empowers personal responsibility. Of course, that's something that draws me into this conversation, like people taking responsibility for their choices, for their body, for their outcomes, their results. So Cowan would argue that you detach from outcomes and seek truth in health. He's got a book, Cancer and the New Biology of Water. And in that, he even extends this to oncology in general. So cancer isn't a genetic or germ-driven war, but a terrain collapse from dehydrated, polluted cells, treatable via hydration, minerals, and lifestyle, not chemo. Cowan says germ theory misses why some resist infection. Like, why don't some people get sick and others do? I.e., the terrain matters. Now, the second character from a more modern era, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. In this case, he's a forensic psychiatrist and is very much a health skeptic. So when I was reading about him, he was described as a firebrand against germ theory. So he insists that it's basically it's a manufactured narrative. It props up big pharma and is used for control. Well, I'm interested in anyone that's putting those things together. Like, that's not the future I want to live in, not the future I want my kids to live in, like more control and a lack of bodily autonomy. So he claims that these viruses don't even exist. Contagion is a myth, and that health is 100% terrain dependent, shaped by toxins, not transmission. So what's his core critique of germ theory? Well, he repeatedly debunks virology as a pseudoscience built on dead cells and manipulated microscopy. He exposes how research uses stained, lifeless samples, creating artifacts mistaken for viruses. And he's influenced by a guy I came across as well during research with someone called Harold Hillman. And he posed the 47 unanswered questions to prove biology's house of cards. He was a British guy born 1936, died 2016, a neurobiologist and professor at the University of Surrey. And he was radically critical of cell biology and argued that much of modern biology relies on artifacts from preparation techniques. As you go down these rabbit holes, like why, who, what's the incentive? And it's very clear to me quite quickly. It's like germ theory, lots of incentive to paint and make money. Terrain theory, individual accountability. I know which side I'm leaning towards, right? You can make your own mind up. But if the foundation of modern biology is built on research using dead cells, then the conclusions we've been taught are deeply flawed. That seems like a reasonable point, doesn't it? It's like, what are you putting under your microscope, mate? And these lab testing scenarios supposedly proving the theory that you're putting forward. It's like, how are you actually doing that? And I love these debates, right? Let's get to the truth if we can. So Kaufman argues no natural virus has ever been isolated, making bioweapons or outbreaks like totally impossible. Now his terrain emphasis, like disease, for example, autism or cancer, is environmental poisoning, not genetic or infectious. Quote, autism is not genetic. Conditions like autism and even cancer are the result of environmental factors and toxins. Interesting. So obviously prevention is much more important from the perspective of both Cowan and Kaufman, and they really focus on things like detox and nutrition. How patentable is a detox? Like, mate, go on a water fast for 5 days, see how you feel.